subtle aspects and considerations of effective communication. Here on this slide, you'll see the basic breakdown of the communication process, which I think is a good starting point for our discussion. And while this process is a continuous loop, it's really initiated by the sender. The sender is the individual with information that they are trying to convey to the receiver, and it's the sender's role to put that information or message into a format that the receiver can clearly understand and then transmit that message through a chosen communication channel. The message is the actual information, the idea, question, or other type of content that is being transmitted to the receiver. And the message can take different forms like verbal, written, it could be imagery or gestures, or really any other form of expression. And it's important to note that the sender should try their best to make sure that the message is clear and relevant to the receiver so that they are able to fully understand and comprehend the message. If they don't send a clear message, the receiver needs to communicate this through feedback, which we'll talk about more in a minute. The channel is the method being used to transmit the message, and it can include, verbal, like face-to-face or over the phone, written channels like letters or emails or text messages, or even, nonverbal channels like through gestures or body language. And the choice of channel can significantly impact the effectiveness of communication, which we'll talk about more when we discuss communication styles and preferences. The receiver, which we can also refer to as, our audience for the message, is the other person or other people who are intended to receive and interpret that message, decoding the message in order to discern the information that the sender intended to relay to them. The receiver's ability to understand and comprehend a message, though, is going to be influenced by things like, their background, their knowledge level, context, and any potential barriers to communication. So because of this, the sender needs to consider these aspects or these factors related to the receiver when thinking about how they will form and communicate the message. This is why, for example, a lot of webinars that you might attend begin with this type of basic background information. With large audiences, it's difficult to know the background and the knowledge level of each person. So providing this type of background establishes context for everyone for the rest of the information throughout the webinar. And you'll hear me mention this multiple times throughout this presentation, but thinking about your audience, their interests, their needs, their styles, their preferences for communicating, when you are trying to communicate with them is really important if you, as the sender, want your message to be both well received and accurately interpreted. So do keep that in mind. And then lastly there, the feedback, that refers to the response or reaction of the receiver once they have gotten the sender's message. It can serve as confirmation that the message was received and understood. It can let the sender know that the message was not understood, or it can provide valuable information about how the receiver interpreted the message. Feedback, which is very similar to messages and channels, can also take different forms that are both verbal or nonverbal, like maybe a question, a statement, or even taking an action based on the message. So now that we have defined each basic aspect of the communication process, let's look at a few fundamental components of effective communication. Okay, so here are some of the primary components of effective communication, and you'll see that they connect directly to the communication process that we just discussed. So, first there we have clarity of message. This is key in effective communication because if the sender isn't providing a clear and comprehensible message for the receiver, and the receiver isn't providing clear feedback for the sender, the communication will quickly break down and neither party will understand the other, and conflict could even arise because there's no clarity of message. It's also important to actively listen. This is crucial for the communication process because the message can be, as clear as possible, But if the sender and receiver aren't actively listening to one another, which includes considering the message from the other's perspective, then communication will also break down. So listening is just as important as sending a message. Openness and honesty factor into communication as well, because if we aren't being truthful or we aren't open to someone else's honesty when communicating, the message won't be accurate, and the whole process of communication basically becomes meaningless. And with that being said, while it is important to be honest in our communication, it's also important to be tactful, respectful, and considerate. And we will talk about this more when we discuss conflict resolution and emotional intelligence. But keep in mind that, you want to kind of maintain that balance between being honest and being tactful and respectful as well. Timing is also really important in communication. As the sender, consider how time sensitive or imperative your message might be. If it's absolutely critical, it should be communicated, immediately or as soon as possible, or maybe even proactively, so that you can resolve or avoid issues. But if it isn't critical or time sensitive, choosing your timing more strategically is wise, because that can, demonstrate some of your respect and consideration for the receiver. Adaptability or the willingness to adapt is also crucial, because depending on the situation, including considering who your receiver might be, you may need to adapt your message or your channel to different forms or methods to ensure that it is clear and comprehensible. Relevance to topic, like we mentioned when discussing the background and knowledge of a receiver, is also helpful to consider, because if your message isn't relevant to a topic that is important to the receiver or to a concept that they already understand, they might not actively listen or might not be able to decode the message in a way that helps with comprehension. You can almost consider this being similar to the building blocks of learning. We learn new concepts by making connections to concepts we already understand. So relevance is important to make your message comprehensible. And then lastly, they're minding differences, which relates closely to adaptability. Senders and receivers both have differences in terms of their communication styles and preferences that could be based on any number of factors. So it's helpful to mind these differences when communicating with different people. Keep in mind that there can be differences based on things like people's abilities, cultural backgrounds, geographic locations, generational identities, and a lot of other variables that can impact, how people communicate with others and how they prefer to receive messages. So that's really important to keep in mind. And next, we're actually going to examine the importance of effective communication within professional environments, but we will get back to, some of those differences in style and preference as well. Okay, so just like within your own personal life or personal circumstances, clear and effective communication is absolutely essential if you want to have a well-functioning and highly productive workplace. A substantial degree of a workplace's success depends on the ability for individuals and teams to share information and collaborate with efficiency in a timely and effective manner, meaning that the better you are at communicating with others, the more successful you are likely to be within the workplace. Effective communication also helps workplaces proactively avoid problems and conflicts and successfully resolve them when they do arise. It also helps, effective communication also helps keep teams engaged and supports personnel in taking feedback in a way that will foster growth, development, and improvement in performance. Similarly, communication is also vital in keeping customers engaged and satisfied with the service or product offerings of your organization. If you aren't supporting your customers or the individuals that you serve through your work with timely and effective engagement and communication that helps meet their needs, they can quickly become dissatisfied and decide to take their business elsewhere. Effective communication can also serve to improve an organization's efforts at innovation and improving established processes. When people are allowed to openly and honestly share issues or problems and propose ideas or solutions in a healthy work environment, positive improvements are more likely to take place. And then change management, meaning, helping individuals and teams navigate complex workplace events, like when personnel leave or departments are merged or reorganized, or maybe a company experiences a merger or acquisition. Change can often create some chaos, but effective communication will help smooth and even avoid some of the potential problems that can occur during periods of confusion or uncertainty. All right, so because communication styles and preferences can vary pretty widely and can also be impacted by a variety of factors, let's take a look at some important things to consider related to the differences in styles and preferences. So we've already touched on, verbal versus nonverbal communication a little bit, but let's now take a look at some other common styles of communication that we regularly encounter. Direct communication. This refers to, senders who are very explicit and straightforward in their communication, leaving very little room for ambiguity, which can be valued for its clarity and efficiency, but can also potentially come across as, rude or abrasive in certain situations. Indirect communication tends to be more subtle, involving, more hints and cues to communicate a message, and can be useful in situations where, maybe politeness or diplomacy is required. But indirect communication can also be viewed as more passive or sometimes confusing in other scenarios. So, for example, if you were speaking to your supervisor about, what is expected of you, you would probably want them to be more direct so that you're perfectly clear on those expectations rather than having them kind of hint at what they want without actually saying it. On the other hand, if you are working on a project in a group setting and you made a mistake, you might prefer that someone pointed it out to you more indirectly so that you could kind of discreetly fix the mistake without it being brought to everyone's attention. Written versus oral communication is probably one we're all pretty familiar with, but there are certainly situations where one is preferred over the other, or where you need a combination of both. Like when you're giving a presentation, you might have slides like this with written communication on them, but then be explaining things related to what's written on those slides orally. Formal communication tends to be very structured and precise. It's also known for emphasizing politeness and respect, and is commonly used in professional situations. Whereas informal communication is much more flexible and casual, is known for being relaxed and spontaneous in nature, and is best reserved for social and personal situations. And again, some circumstances might call for a mixture of both, like maybe a social event with your coworkers. Because you work with these people, you want to keep your communication respectful and polite, but because it is outside the more formal work environment, you might also be a bit more casual with your communication while still making sure that you're being appropriate. And then we have confrontational versus collaborative. And one of these might clearly sound preferred over the other. However, they both do still have their appropriate uses. For instance, a confrontational communication style, which is more, assertive, can be well suited when addressing serious issues, making difficult decisions, or when it's important to establish boundaries or assert your needs or your rights. Collaborative, though, is more often than not going to be a better style to employ, as it has a much lower likelihood to create tension and disharmony than confrontational does. And this is because it emphasizes, active listening, cooperative problem solving, preserving healthy relationships, and achieving mutually beneficial outcomes. And again, each of these styles can be appropriate or better suited than their counterpart in a given situation, but this often does come down to preferences, which we'll discuss next. But I'll share a couple obvious examples. Most of us would want a leader that we are following or working with to be direct, formal, and collaborative in their communication style, but we might have greater differences in our preferences for that leader using verbal versus nonverbal and written versus oral communication. As another example, in an interview setting, you most likely would be expected to be direct, formal, and collaborative while using primarily verbal and oral communication. But really, regardless of situation, it's always smart to utilize proper manners and etiquette when communicating with others. The main takeaway here is that it's important to consider the situation and your audience and their potential preferences when determining the style of communication that you intend to use. So one issue with that last statement I just made, though, is that, the other's preferences for communication aren't always obvious to us. And just like communication styles, they can vary pretty widely. However, if you put in the effort to try to get to know and understand your audience, it's going to be easier to discern their preferences. This slide contains a list of some of the different preferences that you might encounter when communicating with different individuals. Listening preferences. This refers to the fact that some people are more active in their listening, meaning that they engage more in conversations, they ask more questions, and provide more feedback, whereas others could be more passive in their listening, preferring to, quietly absorb information rather than actively participate in the conversation. Cultural and regional differences could also impact someone's communication style and preference depending on, varying norms and expectations. For example, things like level of directness or formality and nonverbal cues, they can vary pretty widely based on cultural and regional differences. Generational differences could also cause differences in communication preferences. For example, people in the what is known as the baby boomer generation or Generation X, the generation right after the baby boomers, might prefer more traditional methods of communication like face-to-face or over the phone. That's not always true, but often it is. Whereas millennials and members of Gen Z might prefer digital methods of communication like emails, text messages, or different messaging apps. People also have different visual, auditory, and kinesthetic preferences. What this means is that some people prefer, seeing communication through written text or visual aids like graphics and diagrams. Others prefer to hear their communication spoken aloud, and others yet prefer, tactile or hands-on methods of communication. And time orientation, this can refer to, the time of day that communication takes place, which is particularly important to consider if you're working with distributed teams across different time zones. But it can also refer to, being future oriented, meaning that you're focusing on goals and plans, or past oriented, emphasizing, historical context and experience. Time orientation can also refer to how closely to an event someone is ready to communicate about that event. Some people want to discuss things immediately. Others prefer a bit of time to kind of process on their own before they're ready to discuss something. And then people also tend to have different technology preferences, which we will dive into more detail on the next few slides. But basically, this means that there are a number of different technical methods of communication, and people tend to have their preferences in regards to which tools they use. And because our preferences can vary so widely based on, a number of different variables, it can be a wise approach to simply ask your immediate team members their preference for communicating rather than just assuming that everyone likes to communicate the same way as you, or that they will prefer to communicate based on stereotypes. This isn't always a possibility. Directly asking people their preferences isn't always a possibility, though. So just make sure, like we mentioned with communication styles, that you are exercising, appropriate etiquette and being as polite and respectful as possible whenever you're communicating with others. All right, so now we're going to talk about some of the technology tools you can use to communicate with others and some best practices for using these tools in a professional environment. More and more people these days are working in environments where they are either entirely remote or maybe working with a hybrid or flexible schedule or working with distributed teams across different time zones. So because of this, we've seen a dramatic increase in the prevalence of remote communication and collaboration tools. In fact, one of the main criticisms of remote work that detractors often use is that it impedes the ability to collaborate effectively, which is really only true if you aren't adopting the right communication tools and teaching and encouraging your teams to use them in the most productive way. Regardless, though, if you want to be able to communicate effectively in our current and future world of work, it's a good idea to learn at least one or two remote communication tools from each of the categories that are listed on this slide. Excuse me. Most of us already know how to use, at least one video conferencing platform, but there are also tools to help make it easier to, quickly message someone or have, a text-based conversation through a professional platform. There are also tools to improve your ability to collaborate with others directly on projects or share large amounts of information or data between people that could be, half a world away. But it is important to know which tool to use for a particular situation. Your team or company might have an established communication protocol, which if they do, you should make sure to follow it. But you can determine which tool is best just by sort of, reasoning things out on a situation by situation basis. For example, if I have, just a really quick question to ask a teammate and I'm hoping that they can give me a quick response, I'll probably turn to a messaging platform. If I've been, maybe drafting a proposal or an outline for a project, I'd likely want to create it as, either an email or as a Google Doc that can then be sent to or shared with multiple people. The main point of this slide is that it's helpful to learn a variety of remote communication tools, but to also know when it's the right time to use them. We touched on some of this already on the last slide, but there are a few things to add and a few additional things that are worth reiterating. So if you are already working in a remote or hybrid environment or are expected to work with distributed teams, your organization hopefully already has a structure in place to facilitate effective communication, which you should make sure to adhere to. If there is no structure in place, though, you could try to find ways to encourage the creation of such a structure, maybe by emphasizing the potential benefits to productivity and efficiency that such a structure would create. Just like with other styles of communication, people have different preferences in terms of the technology tools that they use. So take time to learn the preferences of your team members and try to respect those preferences. Also, keep in mind that there are some obvious choices for different communication and collaboration tools for different situations. So take time to learn the best approach for specific circumstances. You also want to be clear and concise with your messaging, like we've mentioned previously. No one likes getting an email that is, 10 to 15 paragraphs long. So exercise proper etiquette and politeness with all your technical communication. Try to be clear and concise, meaning that you are, being comprehensive while also being kind of direct to the point, just as you would through other forms of communication. And then also set boundaries and respect the boundaries of others. For example, it can be kind of unhealthy to be constantly answering emails when you're off the clock. Also, some people are perfectly okay with their team members, maybe texting them, but others aren't. Either way, know where your own boundaries lie, as well as those boundaries of others, and then make sure that you are respecting those boundaries. All right, so we will now finish up our main presentation by discussing conflict resolution. However, we're going to start with an overview of emotional intelligence because having, strong EQ or EI, as it is often referred to, can make it much easier to communicate with others, proactively avoid conflict, and effectively resolve conflict when it does arise. So, emotional intelligence and working to increase your own emotional intelligence is a helpful way to improve your ability to communicate effectively. But it's also a beneficial method to maximize your ability to resolve conflicts successfully. So, emotional intelligence, if you aren't familiar with the term or haven't learned much about it yet, refers to a person's ability to recognize, understand, relate to, and manage their own emotions, as well as the emotions of others. And it includes things like self-awareness or the ability to identify the specific emotions you are feeling in a given situation. Self-regulation, meaning being able to better manage your own behavior and impulses, even when feeling very strong emotions, like staying calm under pressure. Empathy, or the ability to understand and relate to the emotions that others might be feeling by seeing things from their perspective. And social skills, using your awareness and empathy to navigate social interactions and relate to others more easily. And the reason this is helpful in both communication and conflict resolution is that sometimes our emotions have the ability to kind of override our actions or the things that we say. If we're feeling really intense emotions, but maybe aren't sure why or aren't able to identify and understand the emotion accurately, we can sometimes say or do things that we don't mean or treat others poorly, which can cause, communication to break down and conflict to arise. For example, you might be experiencing an emotion like frustration or irritability, which can cause you to lash out at others. But if you took the time to assess the emotion you were feeling and look at its root cause, which is maybe that you are currently hungry, you could likely control those emotions more easily or do something like go eat a snack, which would allow those emotions to kind of fade away so that you can think more clearly and, behave more responsibly. Emotional intelligence also helps us improve our ability to, control our emotions more often than we let them control us. Without exercising emotional intelligence, in that example I just gave, you might just continue along feeling irritable and frustrated, possibly, communicating poorly or causing conflicts in the process until you eventually happen to eat something. And while it does take some time, there are actually some tangible techniques that you can use to help increase your emotional intelligence, like practicing, mindfulness exercises, journaling to regularly write down the thoughts and feelings you experience throughout your day, which can help you identify, emotional triggers that you might not be aware of. Seeking honest feedback from those who are close to you about your behavior and emotional responses so that you can see from different viewpoints how you act and behave in different situations, and trying to imagine what others are feeling and why they are feeling that way in different situations, exercising that empathy. Taking the time and effort to increase your emotional intelligence will lead to more effective communication, which will help you then proactively avoid problems and conflicts. But, it will also empower you with some helpful tools to resolve conflicts successfully when they do still arise. Okay, so on to conflict resolution. There are two main reasons that conflict resolution has been included in this webinar about communication. The first is that, poor communication, particularly in the workplace, is one of the most common causes of conflict. You've probably experienced this yourself. Conflict arises when, expectations aren't clearly communicated, or if someone is not effectively conveying their viewpoint, or maybe not actively listening to the viewpoints of others. Then things tend to snowball into harsher behaviors, like maybe trying to undermine others or attack their credibility behind their back. The second reason that we're talking about conflict resolution is that effective communication is one of the best available tools for helping resolve conflict. By exposing and understanding the different perspectives and opposing viewpoints in a conflict, we can work through the miscommunication or disagreement that led to the conflict in the first place. There are also some tangible tips and steps that you can employ to resolve conflict that you may be having with others, or use to help resolve conflicts between others with whom you work or interact on a regular basis. The first thing you can do relates to what we just touched on, aiming to communicate clearly when attempting to get your message across, which includes exercising appropriate etiquette and respecting the styles and preferences of others, as well as actively listening when others are communicating a message to you. This will help proactively avoid conflict and assist you in more easily resolving conflict when it does arise. The next is to use I statements. If you've never heard of I statements, I definitely recommend doing some research to learn more. We could fill several hours dissecting I statements, but essentially they are a way to express your emotions and your perspective without becoming accusatory. For example, you could say something like, I believe we should explore alternative solutions to this problem that could potentially lead to more advantageous results, rather than saying something like, you always ignore my suggestions. You also want to remember to stay calm and avoid blaming others for the conflict. Maintaining your composure, which can be challenging sometimes, is important in a conflict because it prevents our emotions from getting away from us, which would most likely escalate the conflict. And avoiding assigning blame to others is also important because, when we assign blame, people tend to get, really defensive, and then they're even less willing to come to some type of a resolution. It's also important to try to empathize with the other person, which can help you, begin to find some common ground on which you could possibly agree, which is an important starting point that can eventually lead to a successful resolution, or at least some type of compromise that is acceptable to all parties involved. Empathizing is also important because it helps you better understand their perspective and gets you thinking about why they might be feeling or acting this way in the conflict. And it also helps you understand what you could have potentially done differently, because most conflicts include at least some degree of, fault, quote unquote, on both sides. And then once you've hopefully found some type of common ground to start from, you can try to brainstorm solutions together, or potentially with the help of a third-party mediator if necessary, and then eventually agree to a plan of action that will help you get past the conflict. Seeking a mediator can be helpful, especially if one or both parties are, maybe too upset to speak to the other, or are letting their emotions kind of take hold of their behavior. This third party can, listen to both sides of the story in an objective way, then help each side see the other's perspective, which can, facilitate that empathizing more easily. Conflict really is never an easy thing to navigate, but if you approach it with an open mind and, take rational, logical steps and remember to communicate effectively, it can be resolved more easily than it would have otherwise. All right, so before we move on to our Q&A portion, let's recap with a few action steps that you can take going forward. So first there we have learn and apply the fundamentals of communication, which will help you be, mindful of your audience and ensure that your message is clear, comprehensible, and relevant to the situation. Next, be mindful of different styles and preferences, understanding that people communicate in different ways and that your ability to understand, respect, and adapt to different styles and preferences will improve your own ability to communicate effectively with a wider range of audiences. Be willing to adopt new tools to facilitate communication, because different situations can benefit from the use of different tools and methods of communication. And then work to increase your emotional intelligence and aim to effectively resolve or avoid conflict, because increasing and applying your emotional intelligence can help you prevent conflict in the first place, and then applying or exercising your emotional intelligence and effective conflict resolution strategies can help you improve your ability to resolve those conflicts successfully. Okay, so just as a reminder, a copy of this recording, as well as some resources that were discussed during the presentation, will be emailed out to you within the next week. Do be sure to check your spam folder just in case. If you're interested in checking out more tips, tricks, and resources, I recommend going to the FlexJobs blog. You'll see the URL up on the screen there. It includes a vast amount of free articles, resources, webinars, and videos for members and non-members alike. So with that being said, let's go ahead now and open up to your questions. All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and dive into our Q&A. Before we start answering questions, could someone let me know in the chat section if you can hear me all right? All right, awesome. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So, my name is Keith Spencer, and I am one of our career experts here at FlexJobs, and I will be answering your questions. So, our first question here with the most upvotes in the Q&A section says, "What advice or strategies can be provided if the boss or manager is the person that's creating communication conflict for employees?" Yeah, so this is definitely challenging and not necessarily an uncommon situation, and it's going to kind of depend on what sort of conflict this boss or manager is creating. So because I don't have the specifics there, we can't get really detailed, but with just knowing that your person who is leading your team is creating this sort of communication conflict, the first thing that I would do in this situation is I would kind of understand to myself, like, okay, I can't force them to change. So what is it about their communication, or maybe lack of communication, that is creating this conflict? Knowing what they do, are there ways that I can kind of anticipate the things that they might do in the future? Try to find ways to kind of work around this a little bit. I'll give you a couple personal examples. So I had a boss who was a really big micromanager. So when I would have my biweekly one-on-ones with my boss, I knew that they were going to be throwing a bunch of new tasks on my plate, even though I was already sort of overwhelmed. I knew that they were going to be kind of critiquing the things that I had been doing and telling me to do things differently. So after realizing this, because it was causing me some stress, I would go into those meetings, instead of kind of presenting it as like, I did this way, and then have them pick it apart. I would go in and talk about, I would use sort of like the future approach, like, hey, I'm thinking about doing this way. What are your thoughts on that? So that way I could get their feedback before I had actually done, the task, and not have it kind of torn apart. I had another boss that, was really not very good at communicating expectations. So it was the same kind of thing almost. Like I would go ahead and do something and then find out that it didn't live up to their expectations, and they would tear me down in our one-on-ones, and it was very frustrating. It was taxing on my mental health. So I would make sure to ask a ton of clarifying questions when they had assigned me a new task, so that I really knew what their expectations were before I devoted all that time and energy in completing that project or doing that task, whatever it was, because I was anticipating what their communication issues were. So if there's a way, like maybe take a step back, kind of assess the whole situation, the problem or the conflict that your boss or your manager is creating, and just kind of think about, like, okay, what exactly are they doing? I know they're creating this bad environment. I know that they're creating this negative energy, but what are the specific things that they're doing? Okay, now what can I do to try to proactively avoid those things, or lessen the negative impact? I don't know that I would necessarily bring in my teammates into this. You don't want it to turn it into like an us versus them kind of situation. But are there some things that you could potentially do to lessen the impact there? Could you ask more proactive questions? Could you anticipate some moves that they're going to make and try to sort of head them off before they can make those moves? And then another option is you could try, depending on your relationship with your supervisor, to address the situation. To use some of those I statements, or to ask, I noticed that X seems to, you seem to get maybe a little frustrated by that. Is there something we could be doing differently? Like trying to approach it from like I want to make myself better so that, these conflicts don't happen, not putting, the blame on them. Like, hey, you're creating these conflicts. How can I get you to stop? You want to avoid that accusatory language. If it's really, really bad, you could potentially try to go into the mediation angle, if you have a strong HR department or something like that. But you do run the risk there of that potentially, getting back to your boss. They might think that you were trying to tell on them to their higher ups or something, get them in trouble or something like that. So, I would really use that as kind of a last resort if things were really bad and I didn't think I could stay there if things didn't change, but I really wanted to stay there. So, it is a tricky issue. Sometimes, people will use a supervisor who creates this kind of conflict and is showing no signs of wanting to change as their motivator for looking elsewhere, because sometimes these problems or these conflicts can't be resolved, which is unfortunate. But hopefully, some of those things that I described there, I know I was bouncing around a little bit all over the place, but hopefully some of those things that I described there can help you, kind of lessen the negative impact that you're experiencing. But I know that's really tough, and I do feel for you that you're experiencing that issue. So hopefully some of that was helpful, and thank you for asking that. Okay, yeah, good question here. So, this person's asking, when you're in an interview, excuse me, in an interview, and the interviewer is maybe not reading information on your resume correctly, how do you communicate and or correct it without pointing it out where you could, potentially jeopardize your chances of getting that job? So, the approach that I take is anytime that someone is incorrect or speaking from an incorrect standpoint, and I want to kind of tactfully correct them, is I'll say, oh, actually, let me clarify, and then I'll just say what it is that is the correct thing that they should be referencing. So by saying like let me clarify, it's kind of putting the blame on me, like, oh, maybe I didn't explain that clearly enough, let me clarify, taking the blame and kind of saying like I'm the reason why you're not understanding this correctly. Like you're not actually saying those words, but by saying just let me clarify, that's a good way of approaching it rather than saying, hey, let me correct you. So that would be the approach that I would probably take if I ran into that specific sort of situation there. Oh, and thank you for asking that question. Let's go ahead and move on to our next one. So, what are my favorite books for learning about active communication? Ooh, so that's a good question. Um, I don't necessarily know. I'm not gonna necessarily like promote any specific books out there. There are a lot of good ones. I really like resources on emotional intelligence because the reason I included emotional intelligence in this communication webinar is because it impacts so much. Like it doesn't just impact your ability to communicate well, it impacts your ability to build strong relationships and manage and avoid conflict like we talked about, and really just be successful. Like being emotionally intelligent is really, really valuable, and it's something that we can all work on. So I would probably recommend kind of starting there. But I don't want to throw out like specific book recommendations or anything, but I'm glad that you're considering pursuing more resources, because I do think that that's a really good idea. So maybe look at some emotional intelligence books that are out there first. Then you could look at some other specific communication ones, especially if you're having specific questions about communication. Like there are resources out there about communication and conflict resolution as an example. So but I don't want to like necessarily promote one author over another, because there's a lot of good stuff out there. But good question. I'm sorry I didn't give you a real straightforward answer there, but definitely take a look at some that are out there. I personally, when I'm trying to think about a topic that I want to read on more, I'll look at reviews. I want to see what other people are saying about it. That's how I kind of judge my jumping off point. Then if I really like a book or an author, I'll look at, their website, I'll look at their LinkedIn. Oftentimes they will recommend other authors as well. So, that's kind of where I use as, or the strategy I use as a jumping off point there. Okay, another question here about public speaking. So, if you have a presentation to give for a job interview, so public speaking, you're presenting in front of a room of people. Usually, when you're doing a presentation as part of a job interview, it's a panel of people that are in there. You're not just presenting to one person. How should you present your PowerPoint slides or whatever slides you might be using? Use less words and talk more, or list everything you want to convey. So, the smart approach typically, and you probably noticed that I struggle with this a little bit personally, is to keep your slides kind of terse. So you don't want a ton of text on your slides. It should sort of be a visual guide or a visual aid to the rest of your presentation. So I struggle with that. You saw some of my slides were a bit text heavy. It's something that I try to be mindful of. I try to work on. You also don't want your slides to just be, or your presentation to just be you reading off the slide. So try to keep your text kind of terse or concise on your slides, because again, it should be sort of that visual aid, not the bulk of your presentation content, and then try to speak more than what is on the slide. So you also don't want to be just kind of reading off notes that you have. So spend time practicing your presentation, thinking about what you want to say. It is a good idea to have some presenter notes to kind of go along with the information that is on your slides, but use the bullets or the things that you have listed on your slides as your kind of reminder of what to talk about next. But you should have, the bulk of the content ready to go in your mind, the things that you want to talk about. So that's why you need to spend some time kind of preparing and practicing. Don't go into a presentation, completely cold, not knowing, what you're going to talk about. Have some just some concise statements on those slides, just some talking points, some reminders, some things that you want to mention. Use it as the visual aid like I mentioned, but then do most of the talking yourself, not reading from your notes. You can have some notes there. If you kind of go blank a little bit, that sometimes happens, especially in an interview environment if we're maybe a little bit nervous. So you might go blank a little bit, but you want to think about, okay, if this bullet point pops up, what is it that I'm then going to expand upon, that kind of thing. So hopefully that is helpful for you. I know that can be nerve wracking, especially because it's an interview environment and people tend not to like public speaking as is. But it's one of those things that the more you practice and prepare ahead of time, the more confident you're going to feel going into it, and the more likely you will be able to give a solid presentation. So, if that is true that you have that coming up, I wish you the best of luck with that. Okay, so tough one here. So this person recently left a toxic work environment. It was harmful. There was lacking, of boundaries. There was some harassment going on. Asking, what type of advice I would have for someone kind of recovering from this type of environment. What is the best way to communicate the reasons for leaving that job to future employers? So, you know, couple things here. In terms of recovering from this type of environment, depending on the severity of it, it's not a bad idea to potentially talk to a licensed professional who could help you process that. This is a traumatic situation that you're describing. So I'm the type of person that I am all for speaking to professionals. I am not a licensed therapist, so it's hard for me to tell you, oh, just go ahead and do XYZ to process this trauma. It might be a good idea if it was significant trauma that you experience to speak with a licensed professional. It's something that's at least worth considering. Now, from the specific like career standpoint here, keep in mind that all workplaces are a bit different. So, if that had happened to me, I would not want to go into the next one, the next job or the next workplace, just assuming that same thing's going to happen, because that would probably make it really hard to develop good relationships with people. It would make it really hard to trust others. So I don't want to just assume that I'm going to encounter the exact same thing. That being said, I also would understandably probably have my guard up a little bit. I have had situations where, early on in my career, where, I maybe was a little too open and honest with my coworkers. And, I'm thankful that there weren't situations where, I did get burned. I didn't have coworkers who were out to get me and stuff, but like reflecting on those things, I realized like, hey, you're not going to work to make friends. Like if you do make friends at work, that's great, but also too, it is perfectly fine and actually recommended to keep things to yourself sometimes. You have opinions you have, thoughts you have, you don't need to share everything. So, go in there with a level of your guard up. Like you don't want to be completely distant from everyone and not develop relationships. You want to try to find that balance. So think about like, okay, what were the things that did happen? How can I establish some of those boundaries? Because like you mentioned, there was, lacking boundaries in that previous workplace. How can I guard and protect myself from negative things potentially happening to me? It's not always possible to protect yourself in that way, but I think not assuming the worst in your next workplace and maintaining some of those guards, some of those boundaries, and getting yourself prepared, mentally prepared for that ahead of time before going into that new workplace, that can help you kind of recover, find that balance between being able to develop those healthy relationships, being able to have at least that modicum of trust in your colleagues, but not oversharing, not putting undeserved trust in other people, things like that. So hopefully that can be beneficial for you. But in terms of the best way to communicate the reasons for leaving that job, I would probably not bring up anything about that past situation, because employers. It's tough there because there's two sides of every story, and they might be thinking like, okay, you're saying this was a toxic environment, but what if you were actually the problem, which is unfair. You don't want to get into that potentiality at all. So I would probably just say, this was a situation where, it wasn't a good fit. So I decided to end my time there, and look for something that is a better fit, which this job here that I'm interviewing for is a better fit for all of these reasons. So kind of, quickly gloss over the why you left and focus on, why you're excited to be there speaking to that employer. So, that job just, didn't turn out to be a good fit for me. So I decided to leave so that I could focus on your type of role here, which is going to be a good fit for me. So focusing more on the positives than the negatives, if that makes sense. But I'm sorry you had to deal with that situation. That's really tough, and I hope that you are able to process that and work through that effectively, because that is not an easy thing to deal with. But good question, and thank you for sharing that with us. Mm. Okay, so last couple here are comments. I totally agree. Simple slides, so they listen to you and are not just reading the slides. Very good. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So we are going to go ahead and wrap up. We're quite a bit over time here as is. So let's go ahead and kind of bring things to a close. I really appreciate you all being here, taking the time to ask thoughtful questions. Listen to the webinar. I know we didn't get a chance to address every single thing that was in the Q&A. So encourage you to check out some of our future webinars as well. But really appreciate you taking the time to be here. Hope that this was some helpful information for you, and I wish you all the best of luck in your job search. Take care.